Hey everyone, today I'm talking about wafer paper, and I get a lot of questions about wafer paper from my customers because they're either not familiar with it or they've heard of it and they think that it's something that it's not. And I just thought I would do a video that kind of rounded up everything and put it in one place about what is wafer paper, how do you use wafer paper, can you eat wafer paper, the whole thing. And I do have a blog post that goes with this video. The link is in the description, but you can just stay here, watch the whole thing. And then I do have a wafer paper playlist on this channel. So if you just search my channel for wafer paper, that should come up. And I wanted to add that if you want to see the complete written version of this video so that you can read it at your leisure, you can go to Google and search for the complete guide to edible wafer paper basics. It should come right up. It's the article on my website. Or you can go directly to my website, which is acake2remember.com, and check out the blog section. I have a bunch of wafer paper videos up there. So the first thing that I get asked a lot is, what is wafer paper? Because people think that it's actually paper. It's really not. It's a sheet of starch. Wafer paper is made of potato starch, vegetable oil, and water. Sometimes you get some that has food coloring in it, and if you print on it, it will have food coloring ink. So that also means that it's vegan and it's gluten-free. So I do get that question a lot because people have those dietary concerns. But if you don't have a problem eating potato starch or vegetable oil, then you'll be fine with wafer paper. And yes, it is edible. You can eat it. And it doesn't taste like much. That's another question I get. What does wafer paper taste like? Unless it has it's usually an artificial vanilla. Unless it has that artificial vanilla flavoring in it, it doesn't taste like much. So it's not going to interfere with the flavor of your cake. You can attach it to your cake and not worry about it kind of contrasting with the flavor of your cake, whatever that is. And it tastes, the closest thing is communion wafers. It's just starch. So it doesn't taste like anything specific, but you can also peel it off if you don't like to eat it. It's not going to bother people for the most part, but that's what it tastes like. The next question I get is people asking me, how do you use wafer paper, because they've never worked with it before. You can use wafer paper to cover a cake or to put on a cookie. If you have printed images, you can put those on the cookies with corn syrup or piping gel. If you have a buttercream covered cake, you can just take the wafer paper and press it right onto the cake and wrap it around there, and it kind of works like wallpaper to cover your cake. It's a fast way to decorate a cake. It doesn't take any decorating ability at all. You just cut it and stick it to the cake. If it is fondant on the cake, you might need to, well, you will need to use piping gel or corn syrup. You might not even need to wrap, like to attach the whole thing though, because since it's made of starch, it will stick to itself if it gets wet. So if you get this just a little wet, just very, very damp, because if you get it too wet, it's going to melt. But just a little damp, you can wrap this end to end around the cake, and then it will cover up all the flaws on the cake. And it's stiff enough that it will hold its shape, and it will cover up everything. It makes your cake look perfect. All your friends are jealous, and you can sit there and go, oh, this? No problem. It was so easy. Because it is. It's really easy to cover a cake with wafer paper. Sometimes people ask me, does wafer paper melt into the icing on the cake? And I've heard this about icing sheets too, and I'm going to talk about icing sheets in a minute. Wafer paper doesn't really do that, and neither really does icing sheets, honestly. But it will attach itself to the buttercream. It doesn't really melt into the buttercream. So if somebody really doesn't want to eat it, they'll be able to pull it off. But this attaches itself to the buttercream, and you don't have to worry about it. But it doesn't melt in. It kind of keeps its own surface. Now we get into the difference. What's the difference between wafer paper and icing sheets? I happen to have an icing sheet right here. Icing sheets are made from sugar, basically. So it's sugar and kind of, it's a whole bunch of stuff that makes it kind of like a plasticky sticker, sort of. People call it cake stickers, cake wraps. The main difference is that icing sheets come on a plastic backing. See, I'm peeling that off. And when you print on it, it's a little bit brighter because the sugar absorbs the ink, and it prints a little bit brighter. But because it's sugar, the ink is liquid and it can kind of spread. So you don't want to have an icing sheet that you've had printed and wait for a few months to use it. You want to use that relatively soon after it's been printed. And you use it the same way. You peel the backing off, see that? And then you cut this and you put it on the cake. So again, you wrap this around the cake. It's not a big deal. These are thicker than wafer paper, and they're plasticky. It's the only way that I know how to describe this. It's made from sugar, so it smells like sugar. It has a vanilla flavor. They usually put some artificial vanilla in it, So it does taste like something, and it's going to be chewy when you eat it. But that's the difference, is the icing, the main difference is that it's thicker, it has a flavor to it, and it comes on a backing sheet. The other difference is that icing sheets are substantially more expensive than a sheet of wafer paper. So where you can get 3 sheets of wafer paper for one price, that same price is probably going to get you 1 sheet of an icing sheet. So it's a trade-off. It depends on what you want to work with, but cost-wise, wafer paper is much more economical. People ask me a lot, how long does wafer paper last? Because they want to buy the decorations for their party, but they don't want to wait until, too late to do it. But they think that wafer paper is perishable and they need to order it soon, close to the time that they're going to have the cake. It's not really true. Since wafer paper is only made from potato starch, vegetable oil, and water, nothing in it is really perishable. The only thing that could happen to it if you store it for a long period of time is it could dry out, because it just will get drier over time. And if the air is really dry, I have these to show you. These I printed a while ago, and they've been sitting out. I've been waiting to do something with them, but because the air is dry, because it's winter, see they're curling up, I could easily fix this by putting them in a little box with some wet paper towels. And I'm actually going to do a video showing how to do that, and I will add that to the videos on my channel soon. But I have other videos about conditioning wafer paper. I could flatten this out right now just by holding it over some steam. And I do have a video showing about how I do that. So there are ways that you can soften wafer paper up. I have a video about a recipe that makes it flexible like fabric. It's very interesting. But you just have to be careful about the moisture, because moisture is really the one thing that will affect it. It doesn't go bad, it doesn't go stale, it's not really perishable, you don't need to refrigerate it. It'll last for years, honestly. But you need to use it people say usually within a year, and I think that's just a guideline because they have to say something. But honestly, I could print this and in 3 years it would still be fine to use. It just might be a little brittle because it's dried out, and then you would have to condition it by adding some moisture to it without melting it, and that's the tricky part. That leads me into my next question that I get a lot, is how do you soften up dry wafer paper, or some people say, how do you condition wafer paper? Wafer paper gets brittle because it is a starch, like I said, and it'll dry out if the air is dry. So there are a few ways to condition it to make it softer and to make it easier to work with so that it doesn't rip or tear easily while you're cutting it. And basically what you're doing is just adding moisture or fat to it. If you add fat to it, it doesn't melt it, but it does make it softer. And I have a few videos about how to condition wafer paper, so there are ways to do this, and it's not necessarily something that you're going to need to do. But if you're used to working in a very humid environment, the wafer paper is going to act differently if you go up to the mountains and it's very dry. It's going to be very brittle, it will dry out, and you're going to have to just do different things to it to make it work the way that you want to. And sometimes when you're making wafer paper flowers, that is something that you need to know about, because you need to curl the petals in a certain way. And I am going to be adding some more flower tutorials to my channel soon, so I'll probably be demonstrating some of that. But to condition wafer paper, you're basically going to add fat or water to it. And I did mention I have a recipe for a liquid that you can put on it to make it pliable and flexible and kind of move like a fabric. It's a strange liquid. I came up with this recipe because there are things that you can buy that are on the market that you can spray on the paper and it makes it flexible. But I want to be able to make that stuff when I need it, so I came up with a recipe for it, and I will link that I'll link that video in the description of this video, because it's a good recipe to have on hand if you need to make wafer paper ruffles or something like that. Another question that I get is, how do you cut the wafer paper, and how do you cut it to apply it to a cake, or how do you cut shapes out of it? And can you cut it with a Cricut, which is one of those cutting machines? There's Sizzix, there's Cricuts, I forget the names of all of them, but the cutting machines, you can use those with wafer paper. If the paper is brittle, it might rip the paper, so you have to be careful, and that's what I was just talking about, conditioning the paper. But for the most part, you can use wafer papers with cutting machines, but you can also use paper punches. The simplest way is just to use regular scissors. You just have to be careful when you cut around curves, because when wafer paper, because it's a starch, it's not really, there's no grain to it. You know, like when you have paper and you turn it, you can tear it a certain way. Sometimes depending on how dry this is, it's just going to rip. So you have to be careful when you're cutting around corners and that kind of thing, but you can use an X-Acto knife. I use an X-Acto knife to cut out all of the edible butterflies that I make, or paper punches. But most of the ones all the ones that I cut out by hand, I use an X-Acto knife. I don't use scissors because going around the tiny, like the curve in and then the curve back out on the wings, that can rip them very easily. But you can just usually just use a regular pair of scissors. And yes, you can cut them with a Cricut if you want to do that, but scissors is the easiest way. Paper punches work really well. And if it's shredding, if it's breaking when you're cutting it because the pieces are too small, you do need to add some moisture to it. So look in the section about conditioning your wafer paper, look for those videos on my channel, and that will usually solve the problem. Another concern people have is, can I refrigerate edible wafer paper? Can wafer paper go into the fridge? Because I'm very cautious about telling people don't refrigerate things too long because it could absorb the moisture and melt. And you can float wafer paper on drinks, like on the surface of drinks. They'll kind of shrink up, but they'll stay there. But then when you touch it, it just becomes like a mess. So you can use those. You can use them for garnishes on drinking glasses, like the edges of drinking glasses. Just attach them with a little corn syrup if you have butterflies or flowers or something you want to garnish the drinks with. But for long-term refrigeration, I would not advise that, just because you don't know how humid the fridge is and you don't know what's going to happen when you take the cake out of the refrigerator. Because we all know that when you take a cold cake out of a refrigerator and put it in a warm room, it's going to form condensation on the surface of the cake. What happens if there's wafer paper on it, it might look fine when you take it out of the fridge, but when that condensation forms, the wafer paper will absorb that moisture, and that is what's going to make it melt. It's not being in the fridge, it's being taken out and then having that condensation on the cake form and get into the paper. So you have to be careful with that. But in general, if it's a sheet of paper or if it's pieces, and it's hard to tell what's going to happen. Home refrigerators are usually okay overnight because they're not that humid. Commercial refrigerators, I would not put wafer paper in a commercial refrigerator at all, because they're very humid compared to a home refrigerator. And I have had brides who said that, you know, they bought these flowers to put on the cake and they're going to give them to their baker. And I know that the baker is going to make the cake ahead and put it in the fridge. And I have to tell the brides that's probably not a good idea. And if you hold on to them and have somebody put them on the cake, that will work. But don't let your baker put them in that commercial refrigerator because it's going to melt the flowers. And it's a disappointment for people, but I'd prefer to not, you know, I'd prefer to be cautious about it. So if you're not sure and you want to put the wafer paper in the fridge, do a test run. Just put some in overnight and take it out before you actually have the final cake and see what happens to the paper. If it holds up okay, it's probably going to be all right. But the best bet is just to wait until as close to the time of the party as you can and then put the wafer paper on the cake then. It's very fast to decorate a cake with wafer paper. You do not need to do any kind of long-term planning for this. You just take it out of the wrapper, you put it on the cake. That's all. So it's not really a time thing. You know, it just depends on what your schedule is. But if you can put the butterflies or the flowers or the cake wrap around the cake immediately before the party starts, that's the safest thing, and then you won't have to worry about it. Another question that I get is how to color wafer paper. Like, people say, I want to buy some paper, and I do sell regular white wafer paper, and I have that on my website. I'll put the link in the description. But they say, I want to get this, but I don't know how to color it. I don't have an edible ink printer. And there are ways that you can color wafer paper. The best way is to use an edible ink printer because that distributes the food coloring ink evenly across the surface of the paper and it won't melt it or make it buckle. Unless the color is really dark, and then you have to be careful about that kind of printing. But you can color wafer paper with petal dust. Somebody asked recently if you can color it with edible paint. I would not color wafer paper with edible paint unless you test it first. And if it's really heavy, wet edible paint, no, because it's going to melt the paper. But if it's kind of a dry brush, that might work. You just want to test it out. You can color this with an airbrush. I used to color all my wafer paper with an airbrush before I got the printers. And there are specific ways that you need to do that. And one thing to keep in mind is that when you put a lot of coloring on these these sheets, because it's starch, it absorbs the moisture there, and it might not dissolve the paper, but it makes it kind of brittle and stiff when it dries out. So the paper that you get when you moisten wafer paper and then let it dry is very brittle. It's not the same texture as it is when it starts out. So what is the best way to color edible wafer paper? I already said it's an edible ink printer. To print on wafer paper, you need a printer that has never been used with regular ink and has only been used with cartridges that have special food coloring in them to use in that printer. So you can't buy wafer paper and then print it on your home printer. So I have 3 edible ink printers that have never been used for anything but printing wafer paper. And they have food coloring ink that are in the same cartridges, but it's not, it's just food coloring. There's no chemicals in it that keep it, that keep the ink flowing through. Because of that, edible ink printers are difficult to use. And I know a lot of people who have bought one and have ended up throwing it out the window. And I do have some videos about edible ink printers because it's a topic that really is irritating, because you buy this printer and then it takes much more time to maintain it if you don't use them all the time. They tend to clog up because they don't have the chemicals that make the ink flow through. So you have to use them on a regular basis, or else they do tend to give you trouble. But they are the best way to print edible wafer paper. It's really the only way to print edible wafer paper if you want to do a pattern or that kind of thing. You can paint on this, you can color on this with, like, they have food coloring markers. As long as you're not too heavy with it, that will work. But the best way to print a pattern on edible wafer paper is to use an edible ink printer. If you do not have one, you can either order it from me. I sell printed wafer paper. Send me an email, we can talk. So I hope that this video was helpful. If you thought it was, please give it a thumbs up. And if you'd like to read an article that I wrote that kind of covers the same things, I have a blog post and I will put the link in the description of this video. But it's pretty much what I've said in here. I am also going to be adding more wafer paper flower tutorials to my channel soon. And I have a wafer paper playlist that includes some things about edible ink printers. So if you have an edible ink printer and you want to figure out how to fix it, I might have a video on that, because they're aggravating, very aggravating. But check out that wafer paper playlist and just let me know if you have any questions. Post them in the comments below, and I will talk to you guys later.